Good Thursday or Friday to you, the viewing audience. Welcome to Quiet Before, Unearthing Anti-Asian and Anti-Pacific Islander Violence, Panel 4, The Future. Happy Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. With the month of Ramadan ending, I wish you Eid Mubarak. Before we meet our esteemed panel, I acknowledge our geography and locations represented by the panelists gathered here. We pay respect to the unceded lands since time immemorial of the first peoples, including the Kanaka, Oiwi, Kawiya, Tongva, Yoha, Viatam, Maarengayam, Nakochtank, Piscataway, Lenape, Matinecock, Canarsie, Manhattan, and Munsi. I ask you to join me in recognizing and uplifting Indigenous humanity, our elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This panel, Quiet Before series, acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples. The acknowledgement only demonstrates a commitment to the ongoing process and processes of working to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism. Now for 1 minute of silence, meditation or prayer for our predecessors and ancestors and our dearly departed loved ones. The future stands on the shoulders of giants. It shall remain the genuine modus operandi for post-colonials to consider our real and theoretical positions and positionalities. We are befuddled by centuries of imperialisms and white supremacies to the point that we are reminded daily that we are trying to recover what we are trying to recover has been lost for generations. It was like learning about an ancient Sanskrit writing that my siblings and parents, possibly my parents' parents, could not even recognize or try to recognize at all. Yet we still imagine being, accepting as a fact, descendants of giants who built earthly monuments based on the language of the nighttime sky. How do we attempt at cutting through palimpsestic documents and experiences? We invent forensic ways to return to healing powers of volcanic rock and precious metals, which we know from use that they are practical, especially if they are practically bodily extensions for survival. We expose tools for the weaponry. While exploring the etymological history of European words, we teach ourselves about the root of aplomb. Then wholeheartedly connect the action and state of standing upright to lead, to lead. Can empathy today return to a telepathic past? With the multi-generational Filipinx collective Bayanihan Desert in the Coachella Valley of Southern California, we continue to ask why we are here. How did we get here? Every day we see the importance of knowing where you are, where I am, where we are, and keeping at the fore of organizing. I want to welcome you all, panelists, siblings, brothers and sisters, cousins, aunties and uncles, lolos and lolas. The format of this panel, I will introduce questions and prompts to each panelist and who I am happy to call friends now. Immediate responses can be up to 2 to 3 minutes. Let's keep it strict. I think you all are pretty great about that. Our quiet before team will keep time. I highly encourage dialogue amongst our siblings here. I want to thank you again, Nancy Bulalakaw, for bringing us all together through this programming format. I love that I found out that the word, that your last name Bulalakaw means shooting star. Thank you, Quiet Before team, for the support, the tech support. Special gratitude to the panelists for their time, love, inspiration, and encouragement. Okay, now let's get directly to our friends here. I will introduce the panelists in groupings, and each to respond to prompts and questions. And we're going to start with Anne Keala Kelly, filmmaker of NoHo, Hewa. Talk to us, give us a quick thing about what you did with NoHo, Hewa, the documentary.
Aloha, everyone, and mahalo again to Nancy and to Edwin for being the guy who's in the driving seat for this panel. NoHo Hewa is a film I made some years ago, and it took a lot of years to make the film. For the purposes of what we're talking about here today, I focus mainly on media, a certain kind of activism as a journalist and a filmmaker, because I'm mainly focusing on Native Hawaiian issues and then other Indigenous peoples at different points in my career as a journalist. It's a very particular kind of use of media. And so NoHo Hewa is a really unorthodox film. It doesn't have a protagonist. It's raw. And I made sure that everything in it is real. And it took a lot of years to get that kind of footage. But the issues are what's the most important thing when it comes to whatever any of us are doing in our work. And so in Hawaii, the issues are very specific. What's being done to Hawaii, how it's impacting Native Hawaiians, what's the history, so it's, for me, that film, it's a guerrilla film because I shot at guerrilla, and it's, the most underfunded documentary in history as far as I know. But it's also unique because I actually did pull these really specific issues together: militarism, desecration, GMOs, a history of occupation. Most people don't realize that the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, which has been going on for decades, is become a movement more about independence and deoccupation. Maybe some of you saw what was going on with Mauna Kea over the past few years. That's actually been something taking place for a very long time, for decades. It's just that some of us came directly to it because of the 30-meter telescope. And I'm somebody that got directly involved back in 2014. It was one of those times where, as a journalist and a filmmaker, I had to not be that. I had to make a decision to be helping other journalists. I had to become somebody who was being an activist. And so my work, oftentimes I come back and forth across that line. I can never do them both at the same time. I can't ghostwrite a press release and then be a reporter about it. So I have to be really aware of what it is that I'm doing when I'm doing it. But it's all about, for me, it's all about media, how and when we can access it, because we're so marginalized and our story of resistance is almost completely absent. Nobody really knows what's happening to Hawaiians here. And then when they get the information from somebody like me, it's shocking to them, and they're appalled. I would show them that because they're used to seeing a very specific story about Hawaii. So, I'm already talking too much, but that film is just a hybrid of journalism, activism, and filmmaking. And it had to be the way that it is, but it's very non-traditional. A few things that I'm hopefully going to be able to speak to today with all of you folks. I made little notes for myself here because you're all activists and younger than me, and I want all of you to just charge forward. So hopefully I'll be able to share some of my experience about what to be aware of, when it comes to creating solidarity between movements, because we need that, but we need to make sure it's real solidarity. And always remember, for me, it starts with you. It has to start with us physically, like Edwin just said about geography. Our physical geography matters. Self-care is so important for activists because we usually put ourselves last. And we need to make sure that we're taking care of our bodies. That's our personal geography. Our personal sovereignty is, what are we doing with this body that the creator gave us, you know? So self-care is super important. You can represent anything from that. Knowing where you are, remembering who, like he said, our ancestors, they never forget us. They live in us. So wherever we are, remembering who we are and where we are, and being really cognizant of what kind of solidarity we're building, because I have found oftentimes real movement gets co-opted by the academic industrial complex, by the nonprofit industrial complex, whether they mean to or not. Oftentimes that can weaken movement. So when it comes to grassroots movement, it's super important to stay grounded in your primary cause. What's the problem you're trying to solve? I always come back to that. What's the problem I'm working? What am I trying to do about it? So I think I've already gone over my 3 minutes, but that's just a little bit of the way that I move as an activist and also as a media producer.
Thank you, Keala. You know, our ancestors are always whispering to us, and we need to listen. I want to go to Janelle Wong. Actually working at a university, and actually you're actually doing work that's very, very important. What can you tell us about Asian American Pacific Islander data, AAPI data? What is that, and what have you done that speaks to what we're talking about here tonight about intersectionalities and solidarity?
Thank you so much, Edwin, and thank you to Nancy also. And AAPI Data is a research organization that seeks to lift up our stories through data. And just to give you an example, you know, we really try to challenge assumptions that can be really harmful to our communities. And so, for instance, there is a lot of attention to anti-Asian violence right now, but our data show that not only have 10% of Asian Americans reported experiencing a hate crime in the first few months of 2021, but Pacific Islanders also report that same level of experience with hate crimes, Black Americans and Latinx and Indigenous Americans. And so we're actually seeing that we can't just focus on our own experiences, that communities of color are all experiencing this. We also see some differences. So Asian Americans and to some extent Pacific Islanders, because we do disaggregate those two groups and collect separate data on both of those groups, that both of those groups report more people, you know, asking them to whiten their name or assume they're foreign, for instance, which is of course a huge irony in this colonial space. But we also see that Asian Americans are the least likely to experience and report police violence. They are the least likely to experience housing discrimination, and they are the least likely, including compared to Pacific Islanders, to experience a teacher discouraging them from continuing their education. And so for me, this moment is really one in which we recognize that we are vulnerable to racialized violence, but not just Asian Americans, that we must understand this moment in connection and in the context of what all communities of color are struggling with.
Thank you, Janelle. And I'm so glad you spoke about that. You know, one of the things that I've been really interested in, and a lot of us has been speaking about to that, is the concept of data disaggregation, and really looking at the nuances of what is Asian American and Pacific Islander, what constitutes that, where, you know, what are these, you know, what's the data that really gets into the deep part of who the groups that are represented. And we always want to like definitely think about how terminology in this case very much aligns it with this idea of like, hey, we're not a monolith, and we definitely need to look at those kind of ideas as well. Thank you so much. I actually want to give a one plug too, because I know just to give you all a heads up, Janelle will be leaving us at the top of the hour, but not to necessarily focus on that. But Janelle had published a book called Immigrants, Evangelicals and Politics in the Era of Demographic Change through Russell Sage Foundation in 2018. I definitely would love to hopefully get into a question around conservatism in its role in what's happening with the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, and its effect on that. I definitely want to now get to the next two folks, and you have to excuse my windows. Actually, I remember specifically. So we're gonna go to Vina Orden, and then to Christian Shaughnessy. Vina Orden, International Nurses Day just happened, correct? And we wanted, I think we wanted to definitely speak about the work that you've been doing around that. This is also the project around Asian American Writers Workshop. I'm absolutely taken by the lift up that you do with Tamara Crawford, and I'd love to hear what's going on.
Yeah, sure. No, so I just am really excited to be here. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Edwin. Some of you I know, Rohan and Jess, from your work here on the ground. So I am in Lenape land, otherwise known as New York City. But then also Julie and Jamiee as fellow writers. I've been following the Black and Asian Feminist Solidarities Project on the Asian American Writers Workshop. And it's great that Keala started us off. Edwin mentioned my podcast, The Lift Up, and we actually just read Potiki, which is about the Maori experience. It was a book that was reissued in 2020, and it's exactly about kind of similar things about, land development and colonization, of course, and how the native populations are marginalized. The native Maori are marginalized in New Zealand. As Edwin also mentioned, I'm currently a contributor to The Margins. It's the digital magazine of the Asian American Writers Workshop. And, you had asked us to say something about something we're currently working on. And actually, I was working on this piece months ago, but an essay that I wrote is going to be published on Monday. And it's part of what they're calling the Nurse Notebook. So my piece is an interview with a Filipina nurse about her family life in the pandemic, specifically as a mother of children with disabilities. And I can't believe this, but it will be published alongside an essay by one of my own personal heroes, Catherine Sinisa Choi. She really wrote the seminal history, and probably the only one, of nurses, Filipino nurses. It's called Empire of Care. And in that book, she traces the kind of grooming and also export of Filipino nurses from the Philippines all the way back to US colonization. And so I think when we talk about violence against Asians, I do think we have to talk about the half a century of colonization by the US of the Philippines. And it's really a violence that continues today with things like the labor export policies, right? So just to give you, and I'm going to steal a little bit from Janelle here and talk a little bit about data, but more than 20,000 nurses leave the Philippines every year to work for wealthy countries. And I think COVID has spotlighted the inequities that's really caused by this demand for poor countries to service rich ones. So, like everywhere else, the Philippines is going through another wave. I think it's their third wave of COVID right now. And there is one nurse for every 50,000 Filipinos. They only have enough vaccines for 1% of the population. So even healthcare workers aren't being vaccinated. And of course, by now, we've probably heard the statistic that while 4% of nurses in the US are Filipinos, over 30% of COVID deaths in 2020 were of Filipino nurses. And so writing this essay was actually personal for me. My mother herself was recruited in the 80s during the nursing shortage because of the AIDS epidemic back then. And the Nursing Relief Act allowed us to reunite as a family. But of course, you know, there's so many families who can't be reunited, right? So I would say that immigration policy is a form of violence too, in that we're just welcomed and valued only for our economic utility, but then otherwise we're expendable. So anyway, those are my thoughts, my initial thoughts, and I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've past my time too.
Thank you, Vina. It means so much that this is the work that you're doing. I want to, I can't wait for that to come out. So thank you for sharing that. And we'll get into more details. I can't wait because we're just getting started, y'all. And so I want to go to Christian Shaughnessy, who again was my brother in Southern California, and also was with SBX, and he and I are both members of the organization Democratic Socialists of America as well. So just to give you a little tidbit. So Christian, you want to speak to us about what you're working on the ground?
Good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Shaughnessy. As Brother Edwin was kind enough to introduce me with, I'm a community organizer with SBX Youth and Family Services. I'm also an activist in the Inland Empire chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. One of the great pieces of work we've been doing over here at SBX has been work on abolishing the school police and taking that money and going ahead and putting it into the counseling programs and therapeutic methods that actually work to improve life and behavioral outcomes to our youth, instead of incarceration and the doubling down on the punishment model that has sent so many of our young people and so many millions of our adult brothers and sisters into the prison industrial complex. Something else that we do is working to make sure that following the end of the statewide Division of Juvenile Justice as implemented by Senate Bill 823 here in the state of California, that when these resources of working with our youth, our troubled youth, making sure that those resources go on down effectively at the county level instead of being worked upon by reactionary politicians, reactionary supervisors. It's a great opportunity for us to do the right thing, but in many counties, it's also an immense opportunity for people to do the wrong thing. And we want to make sure that as many of the good things happen as possible. Now, over in the Inland Empire Democratic Socialists of America, I've been involved in a great deal of housing work. For those of you folks who are not so familiar with the Inland Empire, it's very Rust Belt-like. We've had things like Kaiser Steel. We've had many other manufacturing plants go ahead and be outsourced after the 90s and the knots. We've had a great deal of people of color made homeless, and even white working class folks made homeless following the economic atrocities in 2007, 2008, and what happened very recently with COVID. And then because the freeway system is a very blessed thing, if you go and take a look at a map of the city of San Bernardino, it's as if the freeway designers wanted to add as much pollution as possible into an area. The city of San Bernardino is a nice little square with freeways, and then with the weather patterns, God bless the people of Los Angeles here today, but all of your guys' pollution, it goes east and then it collides against the mountains and hills, and then it tends to congregate over us. And so that's something that we're trying to work on a great deal with environmental justice. If we go ahead and introduce a lot of housing for our houseless folks, but then the air outside is still awful. It doesn't do the best. But I'm very happy that I'm here today. I'm very happy that our Asian communities and Pacific Islander communities are being discussed a great deal. I think that we are communities that are not discussed enough in this nation. And before I head on out, Sister Nancy, if you go take a look at the census estimates for the year 2030 and 2040, the Asian American and the Pacific Islander populations are exploding. Our brown brothers and sisters are exploding population as well. And it's about time that we get more attention for our communities, and we are recognized for our contributions to this country, and we are recognized for our humanity. So thank you all.
Thank you, Christian. I think you all figured why I paired Vina and Christian on that one. I definitely wanted to find those sort of connections in terms of labor and the labor movements. And there's so much more that both of you could talk about, and all of us can as well. I want to get to the next pairing, and it's a very special pairing too as well. Jamiee Swift and Julie A. Kim. I got to speak to both of you separately, and I'm loving this origin story of the solidarity work that you're both working on. But I actually want to let, if Julie, if it's okay, I'll let Jamiee start, because I know it was about communication that went from Jamiee to Julie, actually, right? That got the conversation started. So Jamiee Swift, please speak to us about Black women radicals and also the School for Black Feminist Politics. And then we'll get to Julie A. Kim, who will also talk about the Asian American Feminist Collective. And together we'll talk about what's going on in the project at the Asian American Writers Workshop. So take it away, Jamiee Swift. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Edwin and Nancy, for allowing me to be here. And thank you for Julie for thinking of me always. My name is Jamiee Swift. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of Black Women Radicals. And Black Women Radicals is a Black feminist advocacy organization, and we are really dedicated to centering and uplifting Black women and gender expansive people's radical activism transnationally. So that's the mission, vision, and values of Black Women Radicals. And I'm just gonna hop into it about working with Julie and the rest of the Asian American Feminist Collective, which is always a joy for me. But last year, during like the start of COVID, three of my friends live in New York, and we got on a Skype call because we didn't understand what was going on. And so one of my friends, she's from Togo, my other friend is Mexican and Italian, and my other friend is Vietnamese. And we were discussing like the impacts of COVID on Black community, our communities in general, but one of my friends was like really silent. And I asked her like how she's doing, and she said she hadn't been outside for days. And I was like, why have you not been outside for days? At least, you know, stretch your legs and walk around. You like live right near like a body of water, just, you know, just wanting her to feel some sort of comfort as we were all were anxious. And she told me she was afraid to go outside because of the anti-Asian hate crimes and violence that was going on. And I just was so like blown away. And that prompted me to reach out to the Asian American Feminist Collective, because the Black community was disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And then also we saw the uprisings for the movement for Black life last year. And I saw this was a great opportunity to connect and learn from one another. And so our first event was called Sisters and Siblings in the Struggle, COVID-19 and Black and Asian Feminist Solidarities. And so from there, we did other events. And then we also have this great project. And I'm just also interested, and I'll popcorn it to Julie eventually, but I just want to say that Julie wrote like an excellent article, and she talked about how her solidarity has grown, or what she's found purpose in being in solidarity between our groups. And I think I can definitely say the same. And so I'll say a Black feminist OG that really pushed me to think about cross-racial solidarities. There's three, Barbara Smith, Denise Oliver Velez, and Erica Huggins, who I've all been able to have the opportunity to interview. And they really pushed me to think about cross-racial solidarities, because while they were in the Combahee River Collective, the Young Lords Party, and the Black Panther Party, they too built cross-racial solidarity. So yes, it's important to have interracial solidarity and community building, but at this political juncture, we need to start thinking about cross-racial solidarities and building community with our people. Because if we want to create the mass movement that we want to see for liberation, we need each other, and we need to learn across difference. And so I will end there. I think it's so important that I'm just humbled to be here and to learn from each and every one of you. And I hope that we can continue to build this conversation post this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamiee. Oh, go ahead, Julie. Keep that mic on.
Oh, hi everyone, I'm Julie, a she, her pronouns, co-founder of the Asian American Feminist Collective. I was gonna start off with just like what AAFC is, but I just wanna respond directly to what you said, Jamiee, even before the Feminist Collective started, I gained a lot of my knowledge through women of color feminisms, like reading like the anthology This Bridge Called My Back, like just seeing back in the day, like feminists of color coming together and seeing that solidarity back then really inspired me to even start thinking about feminism, and so I do want to talk a little bit about the Asian American Feminist Collective. The collective really is a group of 5 people, and we like to say that we put our friendship first because, that is something that's like a feminist politics that's really important to us. I think with a lot of movement building, we focus on, we need to get the work done. It's so urgent, and we experience a lot of burnout and conflict. But however, we really try to make sure that we're checking in with each other. We have, retreats every like twice a year where we literally just in a hot tub and like talking about like how things are going. And we definitely try to put that first because we find that it actually really helps our organizing. And it also helps us to become more generous with each other, because I do feel like sometimes it's so easy to not be generous when we're not feeling in a good place. So it's, especially with intergroup dynamics, I think it's so important. And so the collective really focuses on the intersection of Asian American identity and feminism. And feminism, I don't mean the identity of me being a woman, but really about dismantling and smashing the patriarchy and sexism. And that's something that's really important because when I first started with the collective, I was thinking in the idea of identity, right? Like, I'm a queer Asian American woman. I want to organize around that. I'm organizing around where I'm situated. But the more I actually thought through feminism and how it's been weaponized, utilized, and, just really turned into a term where people would say, well, feminism in the past was, about white women and like, rich women, right? And that actually wasn't feminism. That was actually white supremacy, And so really being concrete about what is feminism. It's not about just being a woman. It's actually about dismantling the structures, right? Dismantling the systems of oppression that exist. So the Asian American Feminist Collective, we do a lot of community building, political education, but the main goal is building a feminist public and making sure that people are having a feminist analysis when we're thinking about really any issue. So that's, what the Asian American Feminist Collective does. And I want to talk about our relationship and friendship with Jamiee and Black women radicals. I think it's so important, especially now that everyone's thinking about solidarity. It's so important to think about, all of these attacks are happening against the Asian American community. It's so easy to be thinking about yourself, like, oh, I'm an Asian American. How do I protect myself? Okay, funding for the hate crime task force, the immediate responses. However, solidarity actually requires us to think about how our actions are going to impact other groups. So one thing that was really helpful for me, especially with working with Jamiee in our conversation and our ongoing 2-year project at the Asian American Writers Workshop, is consciously thinking about, how is the responses that we're calling for going to affect the groups that we're building with? How are the actions of calling for more police actually going to be affecting other communities? So I'm going to just leave it there for now.
How can you just leave us there for now? Julie, go ahead. Thank you. Defund the police, that's all I can say. For now. With that said, the segue this is a great segue. Jess Ang, Muay Thai, come on, Muay Thai fighter, come on. And please speak to us about what you've been doing in terms of your work. You also come out of FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology. Like you come out of design, you come out of Muay Thai fighting, and like, what is the love our people like you love our food campaign? But you can start with whatever you want, because you know what, Julie just started off with some really important stuff that we're going to get to deeper in a minute too.
Thank you everybody for having me. My name is Jess Ng. I'm currently out of Queens, New York. I am a Muay Thai fighter and also I'm a designer as well by trade. So at the start of the pandemic, I'm first generation Chinese, Hong Kong American. A lot of my friends, I've had the privilege of being born and raised in Queens and just being in like a bubble of just diversity. And most of my friends and their parents are essential workers, and my father's in his 60s. And at the height of the pandemic, where there were just truckloads, trucks at hospitals in the yards, just, you know, to hold the bodies. My father's in his 60s. He was out working as a postal worker. He's been doing that for 30 years. And when our administration was telling everybody not to wear masks, that masks don't work, and just wash our hands. So it was just a huge concern for us because we just didn't know what would happen. So I pivoted my business and started just making masks and being able to ship masks over, medical masks over from my friends in Hong Kong to New York, and started distributing it on the grounds that way to anyone that would work with the MTA or any courier service at the airports, etc. So that also coincided with a lot of anti-Asian sentiment and violence that was going on. So I saw a huge request and need for self-defense classes. I was being contacted by young mothers and young Asian families with children. And so I started teaching a lot of privates, anywhere from like 4 years old to 7, 8 years old, little girls, a lot of little Asian girls that were very aware of what was happening. So on top of teaching them foundations in self-defense, it was also a workout for them since they were home remotely, but also having those hard conversations about them being afraid to go outside because they just think somebody would hurt them. And these are conversations with 7-year-olds. And then also young Asian mothers now wanting to have private lessons to learn how to defend themselves, or just being able to have the confidence during that moment of conflict where they cannot be in shock mode naturally as we would be, and remove themselves from that situation. And secondly, I've always just offered my body on the ground. And that's where I met Rohan. Whether it's to act as a street marshal, to help as a street marshal, or distribute PPE, or just be around the perimeter, just making sure everything was okay, or setting up voter registration tables, etc. And so at the United Against Hate rally that Rohan was one of the organizers for, I came and I was holding up a sign in the back that said, "Love our people like you love our food." And that kind of came naturally to me. If I was just holding a sign that says "Stop Asian Hate," nobody would notice. I wanted to evoke a feeling and something that would really resonate with others, just like the quote resonates to me. And it really resonated internationally. We've gotten a lot of support from Asian businesses across Paris, Vietnamese restaurants in Germany, Asians in the Netherlands, Vancouver, in Latin America. And it's not rigidly just about our food. Our food across the diaspora of Asia, it's complex, it's amazing. It's been appreciated and appropriated, trendy across the globe in any country that you go to, but yet it's expected to be affordable. It's expected to be cheap, but yet nobody really thinks to really appreciate the hands that create that food. There's a reason why our food, we go out to buy it because it's hard to replicate in your home unless you're from that country or you have that training. So really to humanize the people and the faces that have brought all this contribution to our daily lives, from our food to the clothes we wear on our backs, to the iPhones, to our laptops, electronics, tech, everything. And yeah, it's really about appreciating our contributions and humanizing us, but also other communities as well. The campaign that I've been working on, we're selling shirts and posters and everything, but really the donations we're giving back to not only AAPI organizations, but also a Black women founded organizations also that's based out of Brooklyn, to just donate whatever we can so they can financially help the Black businesses that's been there for generations to continue to survive, because every mom and pop shop in New York City are so far behind in rent that they can't even afford to have indoor dining back, because they're either understaffed or they're just like tens of thousands or $100,000 in back rent in New York City.
Thank you, Jess. This is very important work, and I'm glad you you invoke Rohan too, because that's how I got you on the tooth. Rohan, you last but not least at all, and like as a gay son of Ilocano parents, I already told you, I'm totally inspired by the work that you're doing right now. Tell us about the Blasian March. What's going on June 5th? What is it? What's going on, founder of Blasian March? Go ahead.
Oh, I can't. Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you, Edwin, and for invoking me and bringing me to space. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so for folks who don't know, the Blasian March is a Black, Asian, and Blasian solidarity work. We do this by means of education and celebration. I also forgot I have to check myself for visual accessibility. I have, I guess, medium brown skin, curly black hair. I have a black blazer, and my shirt is actually Jess's shirt. It says "Love our people like you love our food." So yay, okay. And I guess the Blasian March for me has been incredibly important in reference to or inspired by, for example, Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights Black woman activist, and she said, "When I liberate myself, I liberate others." So a lot of the work for me in my personal life, a lot of my liberation has come through educating myself on my own experiences, as well as simply just loving myself as a Black, Asian, queer, Firebird entity person. And so manifesting that through the Blasian March, we definitely break it down into the education component, which deals a lot with just talking about, I know what Julie and Jamiee were also previously speaking on, just simple education about where our communities have intersected, parallels in our communities and how we have combated white colonial violence. And from there, I feel like, that sort of like storytelling gives us a legacy and a power that I think is a super, super strong weapon against white mythology, a system of lies that keeps us separated to the point in which we self-segregate ourselves. And another weapon I think that we can use against white systems is joy. So at the Blasian March, my structure is centering those who are most marginalized. So creating space for LGBT folk, for women, for disabled people, giving them the mic, giving them the space, and letting people dance in the marches, use music in the marches. We also have performing artists at the rally component. And I think one super important part that this kind of builds, or that I'm hoping to build, is helping people understand that a huge part of white mythology is the theme of isolation, how our communities are taught that we're not allowed to be together, to break bread together, to intermarry, even though that's been happening for millennia, since before race was even invented by the colonizers. And it shows how through our isolation, we exist in this myth of scarcity. But when we come together, when we share resources, when we hold space and eat together and share joy together, we actually can understand that we live in a reality of plenty. So thank you.
And that was one of the, thank you so much, Rohan. That was beautiful. And all of you, thank you so much for doing that first round. And I think, Rohan, you actually gave me a great prompt. Because the stewards of the land, you know, and this is the whole thing, one of the sort of roadblocks of solidarity, to be, you know, to be blunt, is that non-acknowledgement of where you are located. And I think that is very, you know, very, very important that we, you know, that we do that continuously, that those who came before us, you know, definitely, you know, were part of this like real, like that real expansionism, that imperialism, you know, that has brought us into this level of, you know, why are we here? Keala, you and I both spoke about that earlier. Yeah, why are we here, and like what did we do in order to make sure that we're, you know, building that solidarity when we know that we're, you know, we're part of being that colonial settler reality. You know, that we're, you know, a lot of us are in places that, you know, why are we here again? Why are we doing here? You know, how do we build solidarity when we know that that's one of the roadblocks, actually, to be really blunt.
Can I say something about that? Can I speak to that for a second? I think it's so important to know, like you said, why am I here? What am I doing here? It's always about what is my intention and what was my motivation for having this intention. And the more any of us can understand and know where we come from, whether, you know, if we're in the diaspora of our own ancestry, we're far from our homeland, we need to reverse engineer that, find our way back. You know, what happened? Why am I here? You know, Vina was talking about the nurses in the Philippines, and as she's talking about remembering a history of American colonization. Before that, there was this Spanish colonization. And, you know, one of the things about Hawaii that's, you know, people don't realize the height of the militarism of the Pacific, that the largest military command in the history of military commands is here in Hawaii, on Oahu. And the beginning of it was literally the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. And then it was the staging ground for what became a genocide in the Philippines. And the reason I'm saying that is because we already have, for many generations, we have, because of empire, because of imperialism, we already have these incredible places where we intersect. And I think it's important that we remember that. You know, it's one of the reasons it's so important to represent our histories and then see where we do connect. You know, so, I mean, I know might be a little bit off of what you were saying, but I couldn't get it out of my head, you know, after she said that, thinking, you know, it's so important to understand a place like Hawaii, a place like the Pacific, Edwin, like you and I were talking about earlier, Asian Pacific. Like, I always thought the Philippines was the Pacific Islanders, you know, you know, because I'm Hawaiian and because I have so many different ethnic groups in my own family, I don't necessarily see certain groups as being the same as people from mainland China. You know, so it matters geographically where I'm coming from, how I'm going to look at the rest of the world and how I'm going to see my relationship to people from the rest of the world. But we're all indigenous to some place. Before colonization, before slavery, before Europeans realized the earth isn't flat after all. We're all indigenous to some place. And it's so important to remember that, you know, where our own people come from, because that just helps us be better about where we're at and remembering what's our intention and what we're doing. Where am I? Why am I doing it?
Thank you, Keala. Janelle has to leave, so we'll have to, you know what? I'll have to call Janelle on the run. Vina, please respond. Thank you.
Yeah, no. So I did want to pull something out of that thread that Keala just mentioned, and I'm so glad you mentioned the Spanish-American War, and which was of course followed by the Philippine-American War. And another connection I want to make in terms of how interrelated our histories are. I mean, there's just so much that's not taught. And I know, Rohan, you and I have talked about this, about the ways in which we have had solidarity for a really long time. So for instance, in the Philippines, a lot of people don't know, either here in the US or in the Philippines, the story of David Fagan. So he was a private, a Buffalo soldier who was sent to the Philippines, and you have to understand what was happening in the US. It was the same time as Plessy versus Ferguson in the US. So there were a certain number of, Black soldiers who really saw the hypocrisy of going to the Philippines under some sort of, let's face it, like, Christian white supremacist imperialist mission, and sending Black soldiers to kill Filipinos. And David Fagan was having none of it. And actually there were 20 other people who defected. So the US military will probably see these people as traitors. But I think more Filipinos also need to see these people as heroes, because they joined our side, the side of justice. And what was so heartbreaking about that whole situation was, first of all, Americans would also call us the N-word. But it was so heartbreaking that because the Filipinos lost that war, and America decided to overstay their welcome for 50 years, a century, if you consider that the bases were in the U.S. for far longer than 1946. But we ended up having this legacy of the American educational system too, which really, it was a white supremacist educational system. So when you trace maybe some anti-Blackness in our Filipino community, you could trace it to that. We were actually educated by the Americans to no longer see each other as brothers and sisters. So I just wanted to sort of say that, since that was on top of my head.
Thank you, Veena. Yes, I think that's a great way to sort of reset the room, or reset the conversation on so many ways. I'm gonna go straight for it, because we've got about 7 minutes to the top of the hour, and we're going to get more questions from the audience. I do have some questions from the audience, but I wanted to go there, and I think you all know why I was going to go there. Anyone could jump in on this, but I may call on folks because of time. But I wanted to really get a feel of the room. What is your comfort level? What are your comfort levels with the hashtags Stop Asian Hate and hashtag Stop AAPI Hate? What are your feelings about? What are your comfort levels or not? Anybody want to jump in on that? I've had this conversation, and I wanted to see where folks are at. You could raise your hand or take your mic off. Put your mic on.
Is somebody gonna talk? I don't know. I don't know about hashtags in general. I think just it's so important to be able to communicate these things succinctly. The technology seems to control how far we can go when we communicate with a hashtag like the one you're talking about, Stop Asian Violence. Or stop, you and I were talking earlier about the word hate. I feel like we can talk for hours just about the word hate. Like, what does it even mean? It means so many different things, and different forms of violence are visited upon groups, differently. We're not all equally oppressed, right? We're not all equally violated by the exact same ideology, which is white supremacy. So I'm not, the hashtags I think are great for like bumper stickers. I just, after this wave of violence against Asians in America passes, kind of like what's happening in Palestine, after it settles down, people tend to not engage anymore. I think it's tough. Sometimes we do these hashtags, or we do things, and then people who aren't really engaging can seem like they're engaging, or they can sort of be activists through Facebook, but not really activate. So it's, it's a trade, getting something like a hashtag like that out there is important, but also we need to understand, like, it's only going to go so far. So I don't know if that's.
Jess,
relevant.
I saw you on mic, Jess. I know you were getting at, and go for it, Jess. Thank you.
I think, well, Stop Asian Hate got the term or the hashtag was coined so quickly, right? A little bit before the massacre, I believe. I'm not really sure when it was coined, but it was coined very, very quickly this year. And I think it has like, I don't know how many times I've been told, where did all this Asian hate come from? Where it came out of nowhere. It just started. Where did it come from? We all got along when we were younger, etc. But I think people need to realize that violence does not need to be physical. And it's important to think about that and kind of like try to understand that, because Stop Asian Hate now, I think many people see it as only physical violence, or if somebody just blatantly calls you a derogatory, a racial slur. But anti-Asian sentiment has been fed to us every day everywhere, from our educational system to even like the children's books. And anti-Blackness is fed to us every day through media and school and education. So I think when we think about violence, we have to realize that violence does not necessarily need to be physical.
Thank you, Jess.
Can
Anybody want to respond? Go for it, Rohan.
I just want to just completely follow and echo what Jess said about violence towards Asian communities not necessarily being visible. So just to give a quick example, shortly around the time that President Biden made his statement around anti-Asian hate crimes, there was a mass deportation of Vietnamese folks. And that is, in my opinion, the embodiment of the hateful phrase, go back to your country. Like, we're literally sending people who, in my opinion, are informal refugees to a country that the US invaded and destabilized, and are still, quite frankly, still recovering from that. That is a form of violence that I think, simply because the hashtag has been guided by white mythology that has a very, very narrow perspective on what a hate crime constitutes. That's a hate crime. What's happening now with our Palestinian siblings, what happened to our Sikh siblings, so many other brown Asians who experience very visceral violence, that I didn't see a very loud Stop Asian Hate response to all of this violence towards Asian folks, specifically South and West Asian people. And we don't talk about, because Stop Asian Hate currently in media and in the hashtags and in the social media verse is being guided by this very narrow white myth of what is hate, which is only physical, visceral violence. We're not talking about police violence towards Asian Americans. I know last year we lost several Asian Americans to police violence, which is redundant, specifically Angelo Quinto and Christian Hall. I have yet to see a very widespread Stop Asian Hate response to that, simply because the definition of a hate crime that we are using is based on white narratives, which allows white society to avoid accountability. And that intersects with folks like me who are Black Asians. We experience so many forms of violence, not just within the Asian community through anti-Blackness, but also as anti-Asianness in the Black community. We also experience white systemic violence. We experience police violence. And yet I have yet to see a widespread Stop Asian Hate campaign to support Black Asian life. So it then comes to the question for me is, who is actually benefiting from this hashtag campaign? As much as I think it was a beautiful and very important way to document what's going on, as much as I think it was incredibly important to raise visibility, there is the unfortunate result that so many folks I have seen who benefit the most from this are specifically cis, heteronormative, able-bodied, monoracial East Asian men. I literally every single woman organizer, Asian woman organizer I have worked with has experienced harm by one of these men. And yet, for some reason, these cis heteronormative men are being the most centered and getting the most attention, even though these statistics have shown that the vast majority of the hate crimes reported are done by women.
Thank you, Rohan. Would anyone else like to say something? Go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, so my immediate reaction to the hashtag is one of actual pleasure, because I tend to have low standards with this. But if somebody says the hashtag, it's at least on their mind. So I think that's a nice start. But it's something that needs a finish, because I think something that's just flat out not talked about is actually the extent that this isn't something that's personal. It's not even something that's done by the police. No, instead, it's greatly exacerbated by this objectively creepy reenactment of the Cold War, whereby both Republicans and Democrats will say, oh, look at the wicked things the Chinese Communist Party are doing. Oh, look at the awful things China is doing. And then in the same breath, they'll go and say, oh, yes, but we need to increase more money for the police to go and deal with those people. We just don't like the police doing those things when it's done in Hong Kong, right? And so I see a lot of, moderates, liberal types who will say, oh yeah, let's stop Asian hate, but I want to increase the war budget so that we can go and pretend that one day we're going to have a nuclear war with China. That's lovely. I see the Hawaiian sister comrade here, testifying to that. If you look at the sheer amount of military bases that are in the Philippines and Hawaii right now, it's there to pretend that there will one day be this thing the Pentagon calls the air, sea, land battle concept, whereby there will be a great game of battleship played in the South Pacific, whereby World War II will also be reenacted. And then all of these weapons that will never be used, that are being taken away from healthcare, will be used against China. And then one of the side effects of that is, if you're an Asian brother or sister walking down the street, well, now you were blamed for it. And then you were blamed for supposedly bringing this pandemic to the country by people who oftentimes won't wear a mask, because that's something that their president didn't want them to do. So I think the great question I have to have about this hashtag here is, are you actually willing to do something about it, or are you just going to say, well, I'm going to post this hashtag and I'll fund the police more in the name of stopping hate crimes, and then more Black folks will simply be heard about, more brown folks will be deported. So got to go take care of these things holistically. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. All right, right on. One of the things about it too, like I literally, Keala, go ahead. You have something to say? Oh,
What? Can I speak to what Christian just said?
absolutely.
He just made me think about, we're talking about weaponry and, what's going on in Asia and the Pacific and what the United States military has been on about, by the way, since 1890 something, or 1880s, really. People don't seem to realize that, the Japanese Empire and the American Empire battling in World War II was like two empires clashing out here. But those weapons, they are being used against us. When the money is spent on these weapons, it's taken away from children. It's taken away from healthcare. It's taken away from
Goddamn right.
These weapons are actually doing what they're designed to do. They're designed to work in both directions, because if they don't actually drop them on some brown country or Black people or whoever, it's usually people of color. They're not like, invading England. It's already been weaponized in the way that it's being used against us. It's making sure that the money that should be going to people being well and housed and having a decent chance at an education is actually going to war. So the victims of that war are actually the most vulnerable in the country, not just the people on the receiving end of those bombs.
Go ahead, Vina. Thank you, Keala.
Yeah, so since we're talking about militarization here, I do have to say that, there is some intersectionality too with communities outside the US. I'm often asked, like, why is it that I advocate for Filipinos in the Philippines when I'm Filipino American, or, why should Americans, period, care about what's happening in the Philippines? And, since 2019, 550 million of our taxpayer dollars has gone directly to the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police, who's turning around and using that to kill its own people. I mean, I became involved in 2018 with the Malaya movement, which is a US-based response against the over 30,000 people who've been killed in Duterte's so-called drug war, but then also, you know, martial law in Muslim majority Mindanao. And the Philippines is actually the largest recipient of military aid in East and Southeast Asia, and there's really no accountability for it. And so if you are interested in, and this is going to be a call to action, if you are interested in learning more and having a say in how your tax dollars are used, help us to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act in US Congress. You can learn more about our campaign at humanrightsph.org. You can learn about my organization, Malaya Movement, Malaya meaning free, MALAYA movement.com, to just learn more about that campaign.
Thank you, Vina. Yes, let's get going. Let's do it. Thank you for sharing that. I want, yes, go ahead, Jamiee. Oh, the Jan, you had no. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. I was doing a little black girl moment with my braids. I'm sorry. I gotta fix my braids up. I gotta look.
Everyone fix. I got none. But it's time to go. Little break. We're at 7 minutes after the hour. To reset. I do have some questions coming from the audience, but does anyone else want to speak about what has just been discussed? And I'm living for this thread right now. Thank you. Anybody?
One more thing.
I'll
Sorry,
just say one thing.
Yes.
Sorry.
Keala? Julie?
who's talking?
Julie. Go ahead, Julie.
I'll just say one thing, which is that I think social change and social movement is going to be aided by social media, but it's ultimately going to happen on the ground and the relationships that we have. So I personally am glad that, you know, the hashtag blew up, but it's not going to mean much if it dies down and people aren't actually activated.
That's a great point. I think I want to also echo the sentiment that Jess Love Our People campaign. If you want to speak to it more, I really believe that has a very strong message as well. What do you feel about it being a movement?
I think it's been overwhelming, but in a positive way. To have that sign to really empower our community, and also making sure people, you know, think about that in New York, but for it to go global, I think it's even more powerful than Stop Asian Hate, because it's a more positive note. And I think it can be interpreted in many different ways, you know, whether it's, you know, through food or martial arts or tech, or just even knowing our history, having people think, and then wanting to dig more into history of Asian American history, but also, you know, our relationship with, you know, other countries. Yeah, I think it's great. It's been very positively well received.
I wanted to also come back to a question, and we're at 10 minutes after the hour. I want to get to the audience questions, but I do have one question before we do that. if you'll indulge me, and this is where we'll start with Jamiee. I'm always in very like inspired, not just inspired. I just love hearing origin stories. I want to hear where y'all, like, when did you decide to get politically active or socially active, or when was that consciousness awareness? Where was that consciousness raising for you personally? When did it happen? What happened to make that switch, if you will? Jamiee, can you answer something like that for us?
Yeah, I just think for going like in general in my life, like I've always felt like I was around like strong Black women, right? So like that Black feminist consciousness was always there, but I just didn't have the words articulated at the time. So my grandmother is a Black feminist, but she would never say that, but she is, right, to me. But in terms of, I would say like Black and Asian feminist solidarities for so long within our communities, and I'm not going to sit here and lie, like when our collaboration first happened, many people messaged me, like DM me, that I didn't know them, but they were like, why are you working with the Asian American Feminist Collective? They do not care about Black people, right? And it's like, I think it's so important that we do not take individual acts or like tensions that we've had to just castigate a whole group of people and say that they're not in solidarity with us, right? And yes, we can talk about these tensions, but how do we move forward? And how do we, like Rohan was saying, overcome these very white supremacist, cis heteronormative, revisionist histories that have dictated to us that we can't work with one another? And so what I love about our project is, and what I'm able to do is like get into the historical aspects. For example, I love the archives. However, the archives, like Sadia Hartman says, are very violent and they're dangerous. But how can we look at the archives and kind of reframe and tease out those pieces that show how we've been in community with one another? So one of my favorite pieces I've written for the Asian American Writers Workshop is exploring Black and Asian American lesbian archives through Ashe, the Black lesbian organization and newsletter in the Bay Area, and also Phoenix Rising, an Asian American lesbian newsletter also in the Bay Area, and like these intersections. So I'll just quickly wrap it up, but there's this one archive where Barbara Smith is talking to a group of Asian American lesbians. Like, I mean, it's so amazing. I found that. And if I wasn't for the project, or just like my interest in learning, I probably would have never known. And I feel like it's important that as organizers, activists, educators, we don't hoard information. We need to make that accessible to everyone. So one day if I have children, they should know about Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs and Merle Wu and like all these different people, how Claudia Jones was in solidarity with China. I mean, like all sorts of things. So that's how like the consciousness came to me when I saw last year with COVID-19, like we really have a lot to learn from each other than us not learning from one another at all.
Rohan, go ahead, go next.
Oh, Jamie, you give me life, honey. Okay, I'm sitting here just like loving on Jamie. I haven't met you. I'm like, yes. Well, like Jamie, I also grew up and was essentially raised by Black women. And I was also surrounded by a lot of Asian women as well. But for me, I guess the biggest catapult for me into my solidarity work was, oh, we're rewinding a few years ago. I think it's 2014. So it was kind of, I forget which wave of Black Lives Matter action that was, but I had essentially, I was given a book as a gift, Carlos Bolosan's Americas in the Heart. And that was part of my exploration to like my Filipino heritage. But after finishing the book, I realized, because he goes a lot into a lot of the very visceral, carnal violence that white society thrives on. White society thrives on that sort of like extremely physical violence to maintain power. And he speaks specifically to several scenes that include lynchings of Filipinos, of Filipino immigrants. And that kind of opened me up into the whole realm of the parallels of white, very bloody violence towards Asians and Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. That opened me up to the LA Chinatown Massacre of 1871. And, you know, that essentially catapulted me into the Black Lives Matter movement. So somehow this weird, my Asian heritage made me stand up more for Black Lives Matter, which is, I guess that kind of evolved over time, me joining other organizations for not just Black liberation, but for Filipino liberation. In Chicago, I was with Anak Bayan. They're a Filipino youth movement, and that fed into what I'm doing today with the Blasian March.
All right. Who wants to go next? Talk about your origin and in consciousness raising, building that level of relationship, your relationship to racial and social justice. Go ahead, Christian.
My father was and is in the trade union movement. He was a mailman over at a post office for decades. He was over in the National Association of Letter Carriers, Branch 411 here in Southern California, and he baptized me in the fire of labor struggles out here. And one of the earliest emotional impressions that were ever left on my soul, I remember in my life, was growing up in that context and looking at the poverty around me in San Bernardino, California, looking at the houselessness, looking at the pollution, looking at the police brutality. But on a good day without traffic, all it would ever take for me to enter a different country was the drive on the freeway about 10, 15 minutes away to a place called Redlands, California. If you've ever been in Southern California, the Inland Empire, you know what I'm talking about. Every time I go there, I was a tourist. I was not in the same country. I wasn't. And that's what really sparked it off for me ever since I was a kid. And I know that if I am to live a very long life, if I am to be worthy of a very young life, that I ought to do something that would make the world a far better place than it was when I entered it. That's what our ancestors believed in, and accordingly, that's what I have to believe in if I want to honor them. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I'm going to call on Julie.
Haha, I wasn't ready, but I mean, I feel like I've always seen my immigrant parents just like who don't speak any English, you know, just like going through that and just seeing that oppression. I feel like I've always had this sense of I want to do something that actually helps people. But I think it wasn't until, you know, I came into my queer identity in high school where I actually felt like true oppression or marginalization that felt so intense, you know, like actually having to navigate that made me realize oh, it just made me more conscious about like everything that I've been taught, everything that I've learned in church, you know, like it just made me question. It started the questioning process. But then, you know, I actually worked in China for a year in HIV and AIDS outreach work with LGBT organization out there. And then I came back and I started working in the mayor's office, immigrant affairs. So I was able to actually work in my community and work on the first city municipal ID card, which was actually seeing people who are undocumented have no form of ID and seeing how this one piece of card actually can grant access to schools. Like for parents couldn't even go pick up their children from school because they don't have an ID, right? And like, I think just being more exposed to just other people's struggles and also connecting them to my own struggle and my own immigrant background, as well as my sexuality, helped me to connect the dots. And of course, started reading about feminism. Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde really started off for me. Like that was when I finally read words that articulated my experience and articulated my political ideology, like articulated like my political consciousness, like actually connecting it to larger structures that exist, larger systems that exist that were, you know, oppressing a lot of people. Oh my God, yes. So yeah, after that, there's no way I'm not going to be a feminist, you know. Like then I just started getting really deep in it. And, you know, I'm not trying, you know, it's funny because people are like, oh, you're like a professional feminist now. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't right now. I just can't. But yeah, I mean, I think that's how it started. I feel like it's always been there, but having the words and language to actually express the things that you feel, that's when it starts crystallizing and becoming a political, you know, actually being able to utilize it to organize with others.
I love it. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm a feminist too, y'all. Okay, don't get it twisted. I want to actually go to Vina because since you pulled out the book right out of the queue. That was perfect.
Oh, I will always have like the book, right, to pull out. I could have pulled out Bulasan too, actually. Um, it's so interesting. My parents were actually the ones who took me to my first protest. And this will definitely age me because, I mean, I was a child then, but it was 1986. And up to that point, they had never known any other president except for the Filipino dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. And to be honest, when I was older and I was looking at these pictures of the People Power Revolution, I was actually really angry at my parents. There were these photos of my younger sister and me in front of these soldiers with Kalashnikov rifles. And, like I was just thinking, like, what were you thinking? How could you endanger your children that way? But then as I, grew older, became an adult, and looking back on it now, I actually think that anger was really a sign of my own privilege. And what I mean by that is, I've never had to worry about being overheard, saying the wrong thing, and then just spending 2 weeks in police interrogation without my family knowing where I was. I never had to see my friends being shot in front of me. And this actually happened to my dad. And I think from their perspective, my parents were already living this precarious existence under the dictatorship. And so, like, what choice did they have, really? Like, it's like they may as well try to overthrow this dictatorship or die trying. And I think for all of us who've just been through the past 4 years, I think maybe some of our activist work was galvanized by that. My parents certainly recognized, certain tendencies in the Trump administration that freak them out about where we were going as a country. And so, like, I think that we've reached this point. And I have to say, I was talking about the human rights crisis in the Philippines, but there's also obviously a human rights crisis here in the US with the killings of Black Americans, right? And even things like climate change. I mean, there's so many societies, and we're talking about Pacific Island cultures who are really suffering the effects of climate change without being, really the reason for why that is happening to them. So they are being victimized for something that they're not really contributing to at the levels that all these other, the global North is contributing to. So yeah, I am trying to remember what the original question was. I hope I answered it.
You got it. You got it right. Thanks, Vina. Yeah, Keala, I think that's a great segue to your story.
Just real quick, because I know we're getting to the end. I had to sit here and think. Luckily, I had a chance to think. For me, there were influences. I was mostly influenced by my parents. I'm biracial, so I've always understood that experience. And I witnessed something between my parents that was very much about both of them being of colonized people. So there was always this kind of clash taking place. I always had a sense of, from the moment I heard the word sovereignty, I knew this is Hawaiian. But in terms of my own intellectual development, it was Bell Hooks. She really helped me understand a number of things. And one of them is the colonization as like of our bodies, of our souls, of us. But my personal experience, and we all think we understand white supremacy, we understand all these things, but when you have a really personal experience, boy, that can really get to the bones of you. And for me, that happened when I was in graduate school in LA, and a white friend co-opted my story. And she did that specifically because I'm Hawaiian. It was it's a disgusting story, so I'm not going to go into it, but she was trying to publish her own version of my life. It was really weird. And in the process that I had to engage to stop this from happening, I came to understand white supremacy as not just a hatred of people of color. They hate our ancestors. They hate the cell of us. They hate you down to your DNA. Like and I know I'm just saying this in a really abbreviated way, but the essence of that ideology cuts so deep. And I came to really understand in ways that I would rather never have had to understand just how soul annihilating racism is, and misogyny, just patriarchy in general, even capitalism. All of these systems, they're all together all the time. They're not all like talking at the same time, but they're always linked. And so that personal experience just kind of made me understand the importance of representation, the importance of not being silenced, even if you're marginalized, the importance of resistance and having to fight, even if you don't win in that moment. Just showing up is winning. And not being silenced and not agreeing to the oppression, that's winning. And that's something I really had to learn over the years. Like, that is winning, no matter what it looks like out there after the march or after the movement looks like it went to sleep. Just showing up is winning, and that's something we always have to do that. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Keala. Yo, Southpaw stitches. What's your? Go ahead. Thank you.
So for me, I think I came into my consciousness when, well, I've always experienced, racism, but just always witnessing it from the first day of kindergarten. But I never really had the education or the vocabulary to like voice myself or even defend myself or even understand all the nuances as to why things are the way they are. It wasn't until I was working in the fashion industry where I was a designer for a global American fashion house, and my colleagues and the employees in this fashion house were about 80% white. And then I would witness the normalization of anti-Asian vocabulary and jokes, and designing women's underwear for this brand, and just the normalization of objectifying and fetishization, and just cruel normalizing like jokes about Asian women and their bodies. And then witnessing in business trips over in Sri Lanka and China, and how the manufacturers and the laborers were treated and spoken to, profiting off the labor, and then coming back to the New York office and just seeing how the fashion industry was run. And I think there was it was the day after the Super Bowl where Beyonce performed, and her performance at the Super Bowl was a homage to the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement. And then the next morning, it was a discussion about everybody loved Beyonce, but a lot of the colleagues were not comfortable with her performance and her message, and they were just not comfortable with it. She should just stick to music. And then everybody was preparing for the Women's March. And everybody was taking time off and rallying for the Women's March. But yet when BLM happened the same month, it was just complete silence. And I just felt, so much energy being put to white corporate America. And that's why we have those good medical benefits, because they're working us to the bone, but yet fighting for the breadcrumbs. And then basically I just had to quit, and wanting to dig more into getting the education that I needed that we were robbed of, and then gaining the political, social, and racial consciousness to just make tomorrow a better place and just mobilize and connect with people on the grassroots level to further our community for the future.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate all indulging that question. We actually are at the half hour after the hour, 30 minutes after the hour, but we actually were given an opportunity to go ahead and answer more of the questions from the audience. Are you all okay with 15 minutes? Cool, right? It's just 15 minutes, y'all. You got the rest of the night to do whatever you want, okay? I think a number of you've seen the questions in there, but I'm going to be very selective because we only have 15 minutes. And the first question that did come through, and if you raise your hand, you could go ahead and answer it. We could get maybe one or two responses. The first question I'm going to bring up is, how can we best support the Asian community via allyship? Who wants to take that up? How can we best support the Asian community via allyship? Who wants to address that quickly, like in 30 seconds or a minute? Come on, y'all.
I mean, I'll just say sorry.
Jump in, go ahead.
I'll just say real quick. I mean, start with yourself. I mean, I don't know if this person is Asian or not, but start with yourself. Start with educating yourself, and then educating your family. Start with the people closest to you. That's where you're gonna make the most impact, and that's how you can help. And right.
Rohan, thank you, Julie. Rohan.
I was going to say the exact same thing. And so, yay, Julie, we're on the same page. I would also say, learn to listen to what Asian queer, Asian immigrant, Asian feminist folks are saying, and really take that into yourself.
Thank you. I have another question. What do you think is the most critical change we need to make to face the future, build the future we want effectively? There's a question about critical change in future. Who wants to just answer that in like 30 seconds to a minute? Go ahead, Vina.
So in like a Philippine indigenous value, well, first of all, there's kapwa, or the idea of kapwa, which is basically that we're all interrelated, and that we're also all interdependent. And so I think that this and bayanihan is another value, which is really community support and mutual aid. And when this is what we've been seeing, even as certain systems have failed us, for instance, government, and we see the power that sort of happens when we come together as communities who care for each other. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that that's all, and the fact that this can be applied not just here in the US again, but globally too. I mean, we are facing a climate crisis together. We're still in a pandemic together. And even though we think that, like all's well and good here, people are getting their vaccines here, we're not safe until the rest of the world is safe. So we just have to remember that.
Thank you, Vina. Anybody else? 30 seconds. Go ahead. Thank you, Jamiee.
So there's a term I always like to use. It's an Akan word called Sankofa, and it loosely translates to go back and get it, or it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. So I think it's important, if we want to build the future we want to see, we have to go back and fetch our political memories, do memory work, and kind of, restitute and restore those stories, archives, memories that were stolen, taken, erased, lied on, and to retrieve that so that we can have better understandings of what we've done together, so that we can move forward in the future, and not have these same conversations about, well, this community's this and this community's that. Okay, so we know this and we know there's tensions, but how do we look at our past so that we can see that there's been histories of solidarities there, so that we can really have a mass movement we want to see.
Thank you, Jamiee. The past is the future, right? Or the future is the past. I know, Keala, I know you could answer. I feel you, Keala. Did you want to respond to this as well? You good? Okay.
Great.
This is the next question. Oh, who else wanted to? Anybody else? Nope. The next question, from your work, what have you found to be the key ingredients of effective solidarity? What have been the barriers? So what are the key ingredients and what are the barriers of solidarity? Anybody want to speak to that? Who hasn't spoken yet?
Can I talk about that for a second?
Sure, Keala and then Jess.
I think, ingredients to solidarity is, I'm going to circle back to what I said earlier, like always be coming from where you're at. And when other people want to be in solidarity with you, make sure that they really are in solidarity with you and that you're staying with your principal, your primary issue, because we can all connect, but sometimes we can end up losing strength in our own movements by accommodating situations or groups or individuals who maybe are not as on about allyship as they might seem to be. It's really easy to get, when I was talking with you the other day, Edwin, I call it mana sucking, because every movement has its own soul, has its own spiritual reality. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that somebody might want to be an ally, but we got to malama and care for that, the soul of what we're doing. And that's it. I find it much easier to be in solidarity with people when I'm sure that I'm always coming from that place and they're coming from that place too. Then it's an easier get, but stay grounded, stay really grounded.
Mahalo, Keala. Jess, will you respond as well?
For me, solidarity, on top of working on ourselves, really building the relationships, finding and just embracing people in your community that you normally don't speak to or normally don't even say hi to. I think especially in New York City, culturally we keep to ourselves, and we don't even say hi or good morning or anything like that. But really just not just having the hard conversations, but just talk to somebody, embrace and invite others in your community that you normally don't talk to and just creating those like relationships. And then until then, that's when we really start to break bread together, help each other, offer favors to each other and humanize each other. What hasn't helped, I think the power of social media also doesn't help, on top of it being great. It's the devil and the angel, I guess. And just even on social media, just question everything that comes across your algorithm.
Thank you, Jess. Go ahead, Julie.
I'll just say really quick, yeah, love as a feminist practice, love as political practice. And I will say I 100% with the relationship part, because I started, my friendship with one of my really close friends, Tai Toon, who's a part of the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective. And also I'll do a quick plug, Shahana Hanif, who's a Bangladeshi Feminist Collective member who's running for city council in New York City, District 39 in Brooklyn. But, I feel like it was because of my friendship with Tai Toon and just because we're actually just such good friends that I've gotten plugged into a lot of Bangladeshi feminist organizing in New York City. They're running the mutual aid networks in Queens and Brooklyn. So it starts with friendships and relationships.
I love that. Thank you, Julie. Anybody else want to respond to that? I have another question and then we have 5 minutes left. Go ahead. Thank you. Go ahead.
Just really quickly, I think solidarity requires grace. We need to show each other grace, because it's easy for us to talk about this now, but when one of us messes up or does something wrong, how do I show you grace even when I commit harm? And how do you treat me as a human being even when I do commit harm or make a mistake? Or oftentimes Black women are not given grace or shown grace, and women of color are not given grace, nor do we give a lot of times grace to one another. So I think solidarity is a practice. We have to practice, and we may fail at it, but it's about getting it back up and loving one another and showing grace.
Amen. Thank you, Jamiee. Anybody else want to respond to that? I have one last question, and then get ready for a primal scream at the end, right? Okay. Because we already did the meditation. We could do the primal scream at the end, okay? It's all right. I have one last question, and we could go round robin, or I'm going to probably call upon folks who haven't spoken. There is a question. Pretty good. I lost it. Oh, here it is. Can you speak to how communities of color have been divided or taught to internalize racism, perceive one another through a racist lens? And how, in your opinion, can we work to correct this? Anybody want to respond to that? Y'all just want to do the private screen now, don't you?
Can you read that? Can you read that first question again?
The question is, can you speak to how communities of color have been divided or taught to internalize racism or perceive one another through a racist lens? And how, in your opinion, can we work to correct this?
That's a lot of questions in one. One thing I do want to say about that, though, is privilege, like class privilege. We don't usually talk about class when we're talking about race. And it's super important to remember to talk about class, who's privileged within the movement even. And it tends to be a class issue. So I just wanted to make that one comment.
Thank you, Keala. Anybody else?
If I could,
Come on.
I think one huge part of it is, again, white mythology that relies on the erasure of our stories and our experiences. But then it's also, we have been so conditioned by white society to perpetuate these false stories, these false narratives, that we've begun to erase ourselves. So because, again, to go back to my Filipino roots, I'm going to quote Jose Rizal. He was a Philippine hero, and he said, no history, no self, no history, no self. So N-O history, N-O self, K-N-O-W, K-N-O-W, K-N-O-W history, K-N-O-W self. Yeah, okay. And I think because we don't know our stories, we don't know the raw truth of our stories, it's so easy for white society to sort of misdirect our traumas at one another. So like, again, going back to the idea of the lynchings of Asian Americans, that's a story we don't talk about. Therefore, we are taught this false narrative that it's only a Black issue, like police violence is only a Black issue. And that plays into Claire Jean Kim's political theory, racial triangulation, how this sort of like using the model minority myth is being pitted and creating these false stories to say that, well, this group benefits then more than this group, so why should you bother interacting with each other? So I think the biggest key to me in dealing with these tensions and moving forward is really doing the internal education, the internal, as Jamiee said, revision histories, and letting that kind of guide you in your choices.
Beautiful, Rohan. Thank you. We have one more minute. Anybody? We actually could do a round robin. Any sort of last comments before we end the panel? We'll start with Christian. Any last sort of anything you want to plug or talk about that we may have not been able to mention? Give it about 20 seconds.
When the president of France breathes wrong, hundreds of thousands of people go on out in the streets and throw sofas out of windows. Americans have to be more uppity, and we have to be more willing to disrespect powerful people in society. So be more disrespectful, be more uppity, and tell power how you really feel. Otherwise, they're not going to change. And thank you, Edwin, for doing this, and everybody here.
Thank you, Christian. Vina.
Yeah, so I think a bunch of people here are writers, so I will say that culture can be activism too. And I actually love that we're on an activist panel, but we all come to the work in different ways. So I hope we've shown that today. I think the key thing for me is that word active in activist. And it just means, like a lot of people freak out when they hear the word activist and say, it's not me. But we're really asking you to basically not be passive, to engage, like Jess said, with your community, however you define that. And yeah, so.
Thank you,
I just
Vina.
want to say this one thing about that. Movements have to keep moving. We have to keep activating ourselves and each other and be willing to become radical every time, every day, have new ideas. We're willing to shift our consciousness be flexible.
Thank you, Keala. Jess?
Just continue to be active. I completely agree. Not never lose hope. It's a tiresome, lifelong journey, but we're continuing to pave the way for the next generation, and just continue to be vigilant. Continue to evolve also, because as we continue to do this work, we continue to learn and we continue to evolve, not just ourselves, but everything around us.
Thank you, Jess. Julie?
Yeah, I'll just say, don't settle for easy. I think we have to really be suspicious when there's an easy answer to something. So for example, even with the violence that's happening, we have to really critically think about what our actions are going to do and make sure to not just settle for band-aid solutions and be okay with it, and how it affects other communities. And that's how we're going to be in solidarity with each other. And I'll plug Asian American Feminist Collective. Follow our work. We're really, interested and always growing. And I'm really happy to have been on this panel with you. I met so many really cool people.
Thank you, Julie. Jamiee?
Yeah, I would just say that we should continue to be humble and recognize that we are but one iteration of this grand legacy of working together, and that we should always look to our ancestors and look to the people who came before us and give our elders their flowers, and to just know that we're a part of this legacy and we're paving the way forward, but we're not the first to arrive here.
Thank you, Jamiee. Giving you all flowers. Thank you. Rohan, you got your flowers. Go ahead.
I love flowers. I just want to express extreme gratitude for being here. Thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Nancy, for inviting me into this space. And I want to give a quick shout out to the person who connected me to Nancy, Kalayan Mendoza, of Across Front Lines and Nonviolent Peace Force. I'm so tired, I'm sorry. Without his support, a lot of my work would not be happening. And that's kind of what solidarity looks like, making room for the next person. And I know, Edwin, you were harping at me a few days ago, so I have to give a shameless plug. I hate doing this, but here we go. June 5th is the next Blasian March. Please, if you're in New York, come out. It is Pride themed, so yay.
In real life, too, y'all. IRL. Thank you, Ron. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Keala. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Jamiee. Rohan. Thank you, Christian. We're going to wrap it up, but you know what? I promise we're going to do that primal script, so you better unmic. And then that'll be the end of our... Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, we got to hold... Okay, I'm getting the note. We got to hold to that. But we can do a long primal script, maybe, not a minute. I don't know if we can do that. So, unmute. And in honor of panel 4 of 4, let's all do a collective communal scream. Come on, Julie, you gotta
Are you sure about this?
Yes.
I don't know how I feel about this. Did we all consent? Did we all get written consent for this action?
No, I'm just a telepathic. It's telepathy, all right?
Isang bagsak. No.
Isang bagsak.
Yes!
Oh, we're gonna get an eye on that. All right, 1, 2. You could scream.
Oh my gosh, I'm so scared.
You could do whatever. I don't be scared.
He's really called it like yas instead, like yas.
Yeah, we can do yas. Okay.
Yas.
Yas. Yas. Okay. On the count of 10, I'm gonna do a long yas. Okay. Okay. On count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Yas. Yes. And you know what? Kalayan said we would look funny because it looked like a karaoke screen. Cute. I like this karaoke screen. Okay.
Oh my
I want to thank you all. Thank you all the sponsors, and of course Nancy Bululakaw again, our shooting star, for bringing us all together. You know, this is not the end, right? This is not the end. This has to be a pact that we do something beyond this. We can't just be like turning off and leaving this meeting without pledging that. Thank you all again. Make sure Yeah, you know what? We already have the email like thread, so please use it. You know, till we get these things done. So, but yeah, sending love, and we're gonna sign off. We're gonna hold quietly for 90 seconds. Remember that? Okay. All right. Thank you all.